All right, y'all. I just decided to go ahead and do a rundown on the actual quiz to do like a quiz review. So I've got this blocked in the video so y'all can't see, no cheating, but I'm looking at the quiz right now and I'm just going to do a kind of a play-by-play for y'all when you're doing your study. So I've already given you all the supplemental video material for last week and the week before. So that should help a lot. Review that, not just for your quiz, but for your final. And now I'm just going to go over some specific things that I want you guys to know for the quiz next week. So, looking at this, please understand the definitions for the following terms: frequency, phase duration, or pulse duration, alternating current versus direct current, accommodation, pulse duration. I said pulse duration and phase duration. Amplitude or intensity, on time, off time, ramp up time, ramp down time. I think those are all the ones I want you to know. Yes, so know the definitions for each one of those in terms of how they're used to describe electrical stimulation and how those key terms can be manipulated to give you different results out of your stimulation. So just make sure you know those ones. Go back through the PowerPoint and look at the definitions and their exact meaning. The other thing you might be able to, you can't really see here, but my favorite chart, right, with the action potentials for A beta sensory, motor, A delta, and it goes down the list, right? So you're going to have to use that chart to answer certain questions about the action potentials for certain types of nerve cells and why certain types of nerve cells respond differently to different pulse durations and to different amplitudes. So be able to look at that chart and interpret it and know where on the hierarchy from left to right each type of nerve cell reaches its threshold for excitation or its action potential. Okay, so know that for sure. Understand functional electrical stimulation, the example that I used in terms of being able to, let's just say, apply a device to the foot and the ankle in terms of stimulating the dorsiflexors when we're working on gait, right? So that's an example of functional electrical stimulation, or applying electrical stimulation to someone who's performing tasking like a lifting or pushing, pulling movement, let's just say to the paraspinals on either side, right? So I want to fire those paraspinals to encourage core engagement as they're doing a functional activity. Be able to tell me how neuromuscular stimulation, specifically like, for instance, like an ionto, is able to control acute edema or like a high volt, right? So this is the example that we talked about where when we have like ions or separate ions, in this case, as discussed, when you have like blood protein or lymph fluid in an area of stagnant edema, that those things, those cellular material is usually negatively ionized. So what you're trying to do is introduce another negatively ionized input electrode to disperse and push those plasma proteins out of the area for reabsorption, right? So that's that repelling, just like the magnet that we talked about. So understand that's how high volt works, and it's used specifically for edema. Also, be able to tell me, the standard settings for like a Russian stim, and you guys should be able to interpret how using different types of stimulation should affect certain outcomes when you're providing your stim, right? So what are the parameters that I've got to use for muscle reeducation versus muscle strengthening, or versus trying to promote tissue healing or pain control with a TENS? Within that, once you understand, like, pay special attention to that chart that I gave you guys. If you know that chart pretty well, you're going to be able to answer these questions. A lot of the questions are going to be asked in a clinical scenario type question format, right? So you're going to have an example of some kind of parameters being used on a patient. It's going to ask you why those parameters are being used, or to name exactly what type of e-stim that would be, or vice versa. So know the differences between the parameters for, let's just say, high rate TENS versus low rate TENS. Okay, understand how the pulse duration or the pulse width is impacted, is different, and specifically understand how the pulse rate is different, right? Because that's what we think about with high rate 10s versus low rate 10s is it's a low rate living in that 2 to 10 pulses per second versus high rate 10s, which is about 50 to 80. So know those differences. Understand the term accommodation, what that means, and some ways that we can combat against accommodation. So we talked specifically about modulation of the wave, or burst mode, right? Or modulating the parameters of the E-stim, like your duration, your pulse width, your on and off times, right? So those are, by tweaking those parameters, we can help to defend against the muscle accommodating itself, or the nerve rather, accommodating itself to the stimulus we're trying to introduce. Just understand IFC, again, in terms of its parameters and also setup, right? Electrode placement. Tell me about EMG, what we use EMG biofeedback for. That would be for the either relaxation or promotion or re-education of a muscle. How iontophoresis works, it's the same sort of thing where definitely know, like we discussed in the lecture, right? If I have a negatively ionized medication like a dexamethasone, I need to use a negative lead that corresponds to that so I can disperse that medication through the skin by that repelling action, right? Same holds true if I'm using a positively ionized medication like dexamethasone, whatchamacallit, lidocaine, there you go. If I'm using lidocaine, that is positively ionized, so I have to attach the positive lead or the anode to that medicated patch so that it now will repel the positive ionized medication into the skin. Definitely be able to tell me what the most appropriate treatment parameters for like wound healing are. There's only a few that we talked about, so it's high vault for the most part. You're thinking wound healing, you're usually thinking high vault. That's the number one thing that it does in that monopolar setup. We want to know how specifically with 10s, right, especially high rate 10s, how does 10 stimulation impact the gate control to cause pain relief or to warrant pain relief? So understand the relationship between the gate control theory and how 10s is used to work within that theory to promote pain control or analgesia. Let's take a look. Know the difference between, for instance, just in terms, we already said that I want you to know the types, like in terms of alternating current versus direct current. That's pretty much all I want you to know. And biphasic and monophasic, right? So alternating current just means that it's alternating from positive to negative. Direct current just means that it's staying stationary at either just negative or just positive. So go back to those charts, look at that again in your PowerPoint. But remembering too that like a biphasic wavelength, for the most part, alternating current biphasic wavelength is the most commonly used for like what we think of as conventional electrical stimulation. Our direct stimulator or direct current modalities are going to be iontophoresis and most of the time high vault, right? So that's just knowing the difference. Ionto is what you're thinking with direct current because it goes either negative or positive and it stays that way through the duration of the treatment. Understand how on and off time works and why we use on and off time, and what electrical stimulation modalities is on and off time more relevant, right? So we're thinking on and off time more in terms of sometimes with modulation, but more in terms of like your neuromuscular electrical stimulation. So, muscle pumping action, anything where you're asking the muscle to fire, that's where you're going to have more on and off time available. That's where you get your Russian, right? You're 10 seconds on, 50 seconds off, and you manipulate it. Or you're overloading, right? 5 on, 10 off to fatigue the muscle. But it's going to have to do with muscle contractility. On and off time really isn't as relevant for something like 10s, right? Because you sort of just set it and forget it. I want you guys to know, again, the difference between monophasic and biphasic, which is pretty easy. It just stays in one one single phase in terms of the waveform. And then just be able to tell me how you might manipulate certain parameters if you're having some kind of if based on the response you're trying to get within your treatment, right? So we talked about this already a little bit, but how does the phase duration or the pulse width or the frequency or the pulse rate, how do those things interplay to get us different responses, treatment responses by using electrical stimulation? So again, go back to your chart, and if you know more about the chart and you're able to kind of rattle that off, you'll be at a great advantage. In terms of your quiz for next week, I think those are the big things. I just wanted to run them down really quick in a formalized way, but for sure, go back and look at all the videos that I posted already. Those will help a lot. Look at this video. So this sort of just will pigeonhole what you need to know for next week's quiz. And other than that, I feel pretty good about it. If you guys have questions, obviously just shoot me an email before Monday's quiz. I'd be happy to answer them. So I'll be checking my email. And outside of that, don't forget about your SOAP note assignment. You've already got that posted, and a video explaining that. It's very similar to last week's what we did. And I think we're good, y'all. So hopefully this is going to be useful to you, and we will catch up next week on Monday. Have a good weekend, guys.